It is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Kate Brown. Kate is an accomplished author and historian. Her latest book, Tiny Gardens Everywhere, examines the history of urban gardening and its role in nurturing health, hope, and community. She is currently the Thomas M. Siebel Distinguished Professor in the History of Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Kate is also the recipient of numerous high-profile honors, including fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. In her work, Kate has focused on the connection between human beings and our natural environment and the transformative nature of that connection. She is the ideal person to talk to us today about the role of community gardens in society and how we can support one another as we strengthen and expand these critical resources. So please welcome to the podium, Kate Brown.
We switch the slideshow. Hello, everyone. I'm blinded by the light, but it's lovely to have gardeners in the room. This book, which I'm hoping it's going to show up on the screen in a second, is in honor of you all, of gardeners. It's in honor of the communities you've built, and the gardens you've built, and the land you've saved. And so, thank you, first and foremost. This book starts in enclosure era England, and it moves on to Berlin, Washington, D.C., the post-war Soviet Union, and then it stops off in a couple of places, Mansfield, Ohio, think Detroit, Rust Belt, but small, and Amsterdam, which is the opposite of a place like Mansfield. And through it all, I'm gardening. And one thing to think about, like, where did gardeners come from? They came from rural spaces in the city where they were growing and in commons, and they had fantastic practices, polycropped fields. They never mowed until May. They had these are ancient fields with plowed. They kept their trees as an ever renewable source by pollarding them and used them for all kinds of tools. Their sheep, they didn't breed for meat or for wool, but for how well they pooped at night as they moved down the field to regenerate the soils. The most sacred place in an English common space was the compost pile. They were pushed off, right? Here they are being dismissed as, this is an unreliable narrator who condemned the gardeners. But everybody knew at the same time that those landlords' fields didn't do so well compared to the small spade gardener. Improved agriculture just required, which is now what we call big ag today, just required more and more fertilizers, causing more and more erosion, sorry looking fields like this with the same or diminishing yields. As people were pushed out of their commons where they had enjoyed their rights, the right to food, fuel, and shelter, they got instead new rights, the rights to liberty, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. Has anyone ever eaten that? Losing 6 million acres of commons, they got a small portion of that back in the form of allotment gardens, little tiny portions where they calculated carefully how little land can we give them so they can't feed themselves, so that they must work for us. And this is, the beginning of what we, consider allotment gardens around cities. Let me move you to Berlin. In Berlin, 1870, densely populated city, the most densely populated city in the world. People move into these miserable tenements. They have jobs in miserable factories, but they go to the outside of the city and they find these wastelands. There had been wetlands there. They had dried them up. Farmers had farmed them, turned them into sand. But these people, they get together, about 30 people, 30 households together, 150 people. They rent what becomes a Berlin city block, and they divide it up into exactly equal proportions. They put a tiny house in the middle. They start gardening around it. Now, if anybody's ever tried to grow food on sand, that doesn't go very well. And you see these kind of sorry-looking crops there in the plot. But what does Berlin have? What do cities have that they didn't have in the countryside? They had this river Nile of organic nutrients flowing in every day. Sugar beets from Ukraine, wheat from the American West, beef from Argentina. And the gardeners, these working class people who came from the commons, they were like, don't throw that away. We'll take it. You could take all that, spent processed food and throw it in the canals and the rivers, and that's what people did, and you could make a stinking mess. But they took it, they put it in a compost pile, and they regenerated soil. So look what happens over time. Starts to look a little better, right? You can see the factories behind. By about 1880, after about 10 years, the landscape, the infrastructure is more botanical than it's human generated. Here's this, here are this success of regeneration, the kind of things that I think some of you maybe have done yourselves. But then they get together and they're in these little green shanty towns where they're living and they're working, and they say, the kids don't have anything to do all summer. And so they get together and they create a children's summer camp. And they, sometimes people's shacks burn down or somebody gets injured at work and they're out of work. So they take up funds for fire insurance and employee compensation. Sometimes people come in with TB. We're going to build a shack over here and we're going to make it our sanatorium. Sometimes neighbors have disputes. So we'll create an arbitration court. It'll be right there under the oak tree. We think of Germany as the place that first created a social welfare state. And it's usually attributed to this guy named Otto von Bismarck. But it was these people who worked out the first sinews of the Social Security networks through their own hands, not through laws and policies, but through their practices in these garden spaces. Gardeners improved land, they made these beautiful botanical landscapes, then they're asked to move. Developers swoop in. We know that story too. But World War I, there's a big blockade around Germany. No food is getting in, no fertilizer is getting in. People are starving. And the middle class people start creating gardens too. They start farming on balconies and parks and cemeteries. They can do it because the structure is always already set up by the working class farmers in the green shantytowns. So they're the ones who have the compost, the seeds, the cultivars. By the First Republic of Germany is the first law they pass is the Right to Garden Act, 1918. People can garden on privately self-provision on public land. First law that we know of this kind in the world, but not the last. Berlin couldn't do without its green shanty towns. You're never supposed to live in these places. People are still living in these places as gentrification is going apace at Berlin. But as a consequence, Berlin is a city of gardens. It's surrounded by a green belt of allotments, and it's a really beautiful place. Let's move on to Washington, D.C. We know the story of redlining. We know the story that American cities that were once integrated become segregated starting around the 1910s, and people are asked, people are pushed out. In DC, in this corner over there, east of the Anacostia River, had been some old farmland that had been worn out. Developers chopped it up into tenth of an acre lots, and they sold it to Black people who were coming up from the Great Migration or moving from the central parts of the city because they were being forced out. Let me see if I can get this working. We took a look and just noticed that people bought not 1/10 of an acre lot, but between 2 and 6. So each one of these colors is a family purchasing lots for themselves. So what did they do with all that space? They built a tiny house and they started farming, gardening around it. They got chickens, they got pigs. And let me show you what this place looks like. The city fathers at this time were congressmen. A lot of times they were Dixie Democrats. They didn't care to service this neighborhood with any financial help. So there was no garbage pickup, there's no sewers, there's no paved surfaces in this neighborhood, Mansfield, Deanwood, east of the Anacostia River. Now, and this is what it looked like in 1949, this photograph was taken, not 1849. But there's something a little bit handy about not having this urban infrastructure if you're going to have a green gardening neighborhood. There's no paved surfaces, so the orchards and the nut trees that they planted had lots of water that was down in the roots. There's no garbage pickup, but that's okay because everything went into the compost pile. In fact, they had to pass a law in DC in 1920 saying you can't get garbage from other neighborhoods. You can only get it from your own. Because what were people doing with that garbage? They were feeding it to their pigs, they're feeding it to their chickens. They created compost or fertilizer and eggs and meat. The city dump had 300 hogs running through it. Um, in 1950, there were 44,000 chickens in the city and 2,000 hogs. Both animals were banned. If you don't have, same thing with the outhouses, if you don't have sewers running, then you have lots, again, of human manure that goes into the compost pile. The night soil workers would also pick it up and bring it to that dump where the hogs would biodigest it. What's the impact of this? The churches would hand out piglets in the fall. The pigs would run around. The following fall, they'd have a big picnic. They'd slaughter the hogs, hand out the hams, and sort of created these informal cooperatives for food generation. The impact of the end of the Great Depression, when millions of families, white American families, have lost their homes, even though they're getting federal subsidies, Black families in DC have double the rates of homeowner occupancy than white folks. This is a vegetable-powered wealth. When oral historians went in the 1970s and said, you know, what did you do during the Great Depression? Did you have a job? Heck no, you couldn't buy a job. But we had our gardens, and we ate from them, and we sold some of the produce on the streets, and we made our mortgages. Pretty amazing. One last case, Soviet Union. What do we know about the Soviet Union? I lived there in the 1980s, is that they always had a trouble feeding their citizens. Long lines down the streets. There was a famine. They made big ag in a few years, and collectivization in the 1930s. They had a big famine. 5 to 7 million people died. And after that, the Soviets passed a right to garden law. You could take public land and privately self-provision. So all around all Soviet cities was a green belt of allotments, and people would take the bus or the tram out there and they'd grow their own food. And these are what these dacha gardens looked like. Am I out of time? No. The collective farms that gave over the public land would give the worst land they could find. Here's one woman in Estonia showed me what their land looked like in 1965. They had to dry it up and everything. The state would help them. They'd give them plans for compost, plans for how to safely have an outdoor privy. They developed special cultivars that would grow like plums and apricots way up far north in places like the Soviet Union. And so they started to regenerate this land too. And this is the same swampy farm. It's looking a little better. People would put up their food and they'd have root cellars. They'd preserve their food. If you preserve your food, you have even more nutrients and more calories coming out of the food than if you eat it without preservation. Stores are empty, especially in the winter. There would have been a host of health problems from nutritional deficiency had it not been for these gardens. So what's the impact? Between 30 and 60% of the food people ate came from these tiny gardens. In 1991, Soviet Union collapsed. Soviet agriculture declined by half in yields. People doubled down on their gardens. By 1996, 91% of the potatoes people ate, that was the main staple, came from these tiny gardens on 1.5% of the arable land. So next time you hear someone say, well, without big ag, we can't feed the world, 9 billion people on Earth, think about this case. We might start to reconsider that phrase, feeding 9 billion people on Earth, is just a cover for continued exploitation and extraction and removal of indigenous people from their territories. Thank you. This is what became of that neighborhood east of the river. 1954, Congress used DC as an experimental urban planning laboratory because the city was run by Fiat, and they decided they'd have a new project. They called it Slum Clearance Project Number 1. And they were going to clear the central part of the city, but we need to have an outlet or a reservoir to put these 40,000 people we're going to move out, Black people who are living around the Capitol building. And so we're going to move them out east of the river. Why are all those people out there? They have such big lots. What do they need all that land for? So through a process of eminent domain and finding people because they had chickens or because they were growing corn in their front yard and not turf grass, they got rid of people and built this asphalt moat between the white part of the city and the black part of the city, and then built public housing that they called things like, Thompson Square Gardens, which had nothing but turf grass. Turf grass is America's largest crop. We devote more land and more irrigated water to turf grass than to any other plant, more than corn and soy. That's 158 million households today are growing collectively a plant that we cannot eat, that's bad for the birds and the bees, and when you treat it with chemicals, it's bad for the humans too. What are we doing? We found when we looked that these vegetation restrictions that made the lawn the law of the land were passed mostly after 1968 when there was the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And these laws, these vegetation restrictions, passed municipality by municipality. HOAs really love them. You can't have vegetation higher than 6 or 8 inches unless they're ornamental in nature. Now, we know that weeds and ornaments, that's in the eye of the beholder. These are really vague laws. We found that very few municipalities enforce these vague laws unless it tended to be people of color living in white neighborhoods or mixed race couples living anywhere. So this institution of the turf grass isn't an innocent crop. It's something that was created in order to segregate when segregation was no longer legally possible. And we think of plants as apolitical, so no problem. This isn't a political act. We're just making sure that we don't lower our property values. So this is why we have some of the cityscapes that we have today. That dirt and blight and weeds were associated not only with landscapes, but with human beings, especially working urban people who were seen to be a danger. And so what's the best way? Clear it all and pave it. But let's think about New York City. Here's something, New York Times put this together. Here's what, if you're gonna move 50 people, you could have 50 cars take up the whole street. You could have one bus, you could have 50 bicycles, and all of a sudden you have a lot of green space. And New York is leading the world with Paris and Amsterdam and London of getting rid of cars, moving cars out of the city. And I wrote this book to use cities of the past to think about cities of the future. We could have, instead of curbside parking, we could have curbside allotment gardens. Every car, right? Every car in New York City has 2 parking places. Imagine if every human had 2 bedrooms. It'd be nuts. And what happens when you have curbside parking? All of a sudden, I'm outside in the front on the street because I like to garden. But say Carlos here doesn't really care to garden so much, and I'm like, that's okay, Carlos. I'll take your plot, and whatever I grow, you can have 2. So one day I'm out there, and I have this big bunch of carrots I pulled out, and they look so orange and delicious that Carlos comes and said, I'll have some, and I hand him to him, and he brushes them off and takes a bite. Now something amazing has happened. The microbes in that soil, the microbes in my hand are now in Carlos's body. And we are exchanging, we're starting to share microbes. And microbiologists tell us that when people share microbes, they get along better. They come to decisions better. And think about that in an evolutionary perspective. Humans have evolved all kinds of strange practices, like shaking hands, giving each other a kiss, giving each other a hug, breaking bread together, sharing a meal together, going to church and everybody drinks out of the same chalice. Crazy. But what our ancestors knew was that to share microbes was to create community. And that's what gardeners do, which is, I think, why when people garden together in these social infrastructures, they start to get together to share and solve other problems that they have. Thanks very much. This is where I garden. It's, oh, sorry, wait, one more thing. This is where I garden. It used to be a coal barn in the middle of our block in densely populated part of Cambridge, Mass. And now it's a garden that has about 5 gardeners and feeds about 12 households plus a food bank. Thank you very much.